Hi, this is Taryn Lupo, and welcome to the audio version of Pirates of Savannah, Chapter 1. This is a free version, but it does have commercials. If you want a commercial-free version, you can purchase that and support me, the starving author here, at lupoliink.com. That's www.lupoliink.com. Thanks for your support.
Pirates of Savannah, The Birth of Freedom in the Low Country, an adventure novel by Taryn P. Lupo. I dedicate this book to all the past, present, and future liberty activists who found the courage to say no to authority. Acknowledgements: editors, creative editors, April Reed and Reagan Dandridge Desolates. Editors: Margie Jackson, Sky Reed. Illustrators: Ruby Nicole Hilliard, Scott A. Motley, and Lori Messenger. Cover art: Meg McLean, Johnson Rice, and photos by Becky.net. Consultants: Cannon, Musket, Charlestown History, and Low Country Historical Consultant, Reagan Dandridge Desolates. Sword and Blade Consultant, Mark McMorrow. Archaeological Consultant, Audrey Salem. Contributors: Teresa Warmke, Michael Sanson, Aziza Seven, Julie Cheshire Stone, Jim Davison, Mariana Evica, Luther Freeman, and all my great friends on Facebook who helped me along the journey. Author's Preface. Pirates of Savannah is a historical fiction novel that takes place in a forgotten and fascinating time of history. This book is loaded with adventure and reminds folks just what it took to survive in such a rugged, harsh time. I've seen hundreds of great fiction novels written about the Civil and Revolutionary Wars, but almost none use pre-revolutionary days as their backdrop. This book brings forward many obscure historical events that were censored or forgotten by time. Unless you're from South Carolina or Georgia, you might have no idea where the Low Country is actually located. It originally started out as a little section of southern South Carolina coastline and then grew to include the whole coast of South Carolina and parts of the Georgia coast. These days, it's pretty much bastardized to the point where people all the way from Cape Fear, North Carolina to St. Augustine, Florida, also say they're from the Low Country. Perhaps in my lifetime, the entire East Coast will be absorbed into the Low Country as well. Most of the events in the book really happened, and the famous characters are real. I wrote this so the fictional characters weave in and out of real history so much that unless you're an expert in Low Country record, you will not be able to tell where the true past begins and ends. You can always check the epilogue at the end of the book to find out what was based on history and what was fictional. I thought it'd be interesting to write an entire book accurate to the speech and the writing patterns of the time. That idea lasted about 1 hour. After I plowed through tomes of writings of 1700s lexicon, I realized how difficult and time-consuming that style is to decipher. It slowed the storyline to a crawl and took away from the enjoyment of reading it. So I have stayed true and used words from that time period, but not the confusing writing and speaking styles. You need to remember, standard rules for grammar didn't come into play until the 1800s, so pretty much anything went. One could spell the same word 5 different ways and use them all in one giant run-on sentence. If you're the kind of person with grammar and spelling OCD, then you would have never survived back then. One last thing about spelling. Some spelling was changed over time. When the book talks about Charlestown instead of Charleston, or Jekyll Island with 1 L instead of Jekyll Island with 2 L's, it's not a mistake. Even some of the famous people in the book have multiple ways to spell their name. So if a name looks different than the way you remember it, it's because I have chose the version I came across the most. Here are some other things you might need to know before diving into this book. The 1700s were filthy. I mean really, really disgusting. Think of the grossest rugby or frat house and multiply it by 100 times. Any personal hygiene was a luxury, and most common folks only bathed once a season. Average people owned only one set of clothes and would have never seen soap. My father even asked me to include a warning about the vividness of the first chapter of the book. He wanted me to tell you that the rest of the book is not that squalid. Oh, everybody's a critic. I'm sure you've heard the saying, history is written by the winners. I never realized how true that was until I dove into stacks of old writings. People forget in this day and age how writings which criticize the powers that be was the fastest way to a noose. Most of the writings that survived that time period were king's correspondences, military's records, and propaganda. When I was doing my research, I tried to look past the flowery good reports and extrapolate on what was really going on behind the scenes. Most people in school learn a watered-down version of why colonists came to America. I was always told they came over so they could practice their religion without fear of being killed by the king. Now, it is true that many did escape from the king's religious persecution, but that's not the whole story. Many others came over to escape the rule of government altogether. Some of those settlers were this nation's first freedom activists. They fled from generations of government tyranny in their homelands and came to the colonies hoping just to be left alone, to finally live a life without some government or authority telling them how they must live. The strong anti-government and pro-individual freedom message of the first settlers was censored over the years, especially after the Civil War. When people think about the Revolutionary War, the first images that come to mind are the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, First Continental Congress, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Did you happen to notice that all these celebrated events happened in the North? Interesting, since 2/3 of the Revolutionary War was fought in the South. How come all the events people celebrate are Northern victories? Part of the reason was Ben Franklin had his hand in most of the printing during that time and wanted to promote himself in the Northern states. But the big reason for this is because after the South lost the War of Southern Secession, or the Civil War, the North purposely erased as much Southern history as it could. A propaganda campaign played out to change Southern minds so they would stop seeing themselves as independent and instead see themselves as part of one new nation. That held over and continued forward even today. Just pick up a public or government school's history book and see what events are celebrated and what events are omitted. I hope to do my part to reteach that bit of missing rabble-rousing history through an exciting and interesting story instead of a boring, crusty history book. You can also find the print book, the e-book, audiobook, as well as lots of video extras at www.piratesofsavannahbook.com. Again, all one word, piratesofsavannahbook.com. Good hunting, Terran B. Lupo. Pirates of Savannah, Chapter 1, Debtor's Prison. Like a religious experience, the sun flooded the prison cell, blinding the young man. A thick black cloud of buzzing flies poured out the door as they rushed into the light that was bathing the young man, who was now rubbing the darkness from his eyes. He could only squint at the intrusion of the light and make out a blurry black cloud of flies that seemed like smoke madly escaping from a burning building. It seemed to go on for minutes as thousands of flies swarmed out, and his eyes adjusted to the first light they had seen in 2 long weeks. 14 days without a hint of light, sealed in complete darkness, is not quickly erased from the eye. But after a few moments, he could see the guards. Their noses and mouths were covered with tattered rags tied tightly behind their heads, revealing only their eyes that were wide with fear of the disease that had swept through the prison so quickly. Even their hands were wrapped thick with cloth like filthy mittens. No chances would be taken this close to the foul of the cells, littered with emaciated, diseased, and dying prisoners. The man watched dispassionately as a guard barked a muffled order to another inmate to drag the dead from the cell to the fire pit to be burned. The man smiled weakly and thought, "It must smell rosy in the barracks." He knew the guards only allowed the prisoners to remove the dead bodies when the festering smell of pox would creep into their quarters. The prison cells used to be sanitary, but that was before the rampant pox. The only thing that spread faster than the pox was the fear of the pox. In response, the dungeon had been sealed, and unlucky, frightened guards were assigned to leave food and water by the door once a day. A selected few inmates were allowed to go to the door and retrieve the food and dispense it to their fellow prisoners, but the guards made sure only the healthy received the poor excuse for nourishment in this pit. The sick were too weak, unconscious, or dying to waste the victuals and water on. The cell had become a dumping ground for those who did not have the minor great pox, but rather the more deadly smallpox. A few unfortunate souls suffered from the malignant variety, or worse yet, the dreaded black pox. In a place where human refuge resigned, it was no surprise that smallpox struck the prisoners with such fury, their bodies breaking out into papules filling with opalescent fluid. It was only a matter of time until the remaining sick would join their fellow inmates in the deep fire pit in the yard outside the prison. The extremely massive but emaciated prisoner dragging the corpses was handling his job with slight grace, and soon became nauseated by the thick ammonia fumes from the fowl on the floor. He became overwhelmed, and gripping his stomach, he paused, only to expel his meal all over the bloated, pus-filled bodies that were at his feet. His vomit that did not get stuck in his long beard was added spice to the floor that had already covered in black and green slippery slosh, a combination of feces, urine, blood, dried crusted semen, and diseased vomit, an inch thick, that prisoners referred to as the vile sludge. The men had almost forgotten the floor was alive until they saw it again in the rare sunlight beaming in the open door. He recoiled from the sight. Throngs of maggots, fungus, and flies laying their nests in the filth. He had grown so accustomed to the constant buzz of flies and beetles coming from below his feet, he no longer heard them. But their squirming bodies, now illuminated, gave the illusion that the floor was a living, moving organism. There was a time that chamber buckets would have served to keep the cell sanitary, but they had since become overfilled and obsolete. The guards, so sickened by the smell of the prisoners dumping the buckets, simply let the pots succumb to the vile sludge over time, until they were simply two large mounds of fungus and shit. "Hurry it up," a guard commanded to the prisoner, who was puking instead of dragging bodies. The man could see the horror in the guard's eyes. They wanted to be exposed to the filth and disease of the cell as little as possible, and it was already taking too long. The man could almost hear the guards desperately wondering if they made a mistake, questioning if the prisoner they chose to drag the bodies was sick himself. The man smiled again, blinking in the blinding light, and thought, "Serves the bastards right." To add to the madness of the cells, most prisoners were touched in the mind from prolonged fevers they contracted. Their bodies would rebel from the smells of the floor until even their physical senses left them. Soon they crumpled like wet papier-mâché to strewn in their own bile. Weakness would overtake their wills, and they would eventually fall into the puddles of decaying and fresh human waste on the floor. The man would listen from a bench with his knees drawn up to his chest and his arms wrapped around his knees, hearing the wet, flat sounds of bodies hitting the floor. The only reason he was not dead from infection was the sanctuary of the bench he sat on. It was the only bench in the cell, and it was like an island, just enough room for 6 castaways. The old wooden bench had been broken so many times in the past, it was now barely being held together with a rigging of thigh bones and rags taken from dead prisoners to keep it standing. Now, with an empty stomach and a chest and beard covered with brown vomit, the nauseous prisoner soon regained his composure enough to finish his chore and dragged the corpses into the hall one by one. The man closed his eyes and rested his head on his knees, drawn to his chest as the guards closed and locked the heavy cell door, leaving him once again in the darkness. With only the constant wails and moanings of the dying to keep him company, the man, just as he had done every day for the past 7 years, returned to thoughts of home and that fateful day of his arrest. He rubbed the long scar on his left jaw and silently vowed that he would live to meet William Potts again. His name was Patrick Willis, and he had once been an aspiring jeweler. His father was a jeweler to high society in the outskirts of London. Sadly, his father died of consumption when Patrick was 15. It was a horrible, slow death of hacking coughs, phlegm, and blood. The fever lingered long, making the elder Willis lose his mind, and quickly sunk Patrick's family into debt. Patrick's family placed the patriarch in a sanitarium, which promised to cure him. But the money ran out before the cure was found, and the sick old man had to be moved back home, where he was cared for by Patrick's mother and his 3 sisters. Before his father's debts were called, Patrick made a desperate move to keep him out of prison, still hoping he would recover. He took every scrap of valuable jewelry the family had left and went to make a deal with a competing ruthless jeweler named William Potts to buy their family's interest out. He hid the jewelry well and disguised himself as a pauper while traveling to Potts' shop so as not to arouse suspicion. Fortunately, Potts recognized Patrick as soon as he entered the shop and did not throw Patrick into the street as he normally would any true pauper. Potts invited Patrick to the back of the shop so that the young man could display his wares, which he kept in a hidden bag concealed on his person. The swag was mostly bits of wire, scraps of silver, and a few rare stones. If he had the luxury of time, Patrick could have found buyers fetching a decent price for the swag, possibly just enough to pay his father's debts. Sadly, this was not the case. Patrick did not have time, and he had to desperately acquire as much money as he could before his father was sent off to debtor's prison. Mr. Potts scratched his chin, taking painfully long to examine the swag. He could see the sweat beading on the young man's brow. He relished in Patrick's desperation and anxiousness. The older Potts assumed correctly this was Patrick's first financial transaction. He had also heard rumors of the elder Willis's plight, and was quite happy to see his competition sinking into illness, debt, and desperation. Mr. Potts slowly examined every stone, rolling them in his fingers and occasionally sighing for effect. The master jeweler took far more time than he needed, considering the level of his expertise. It was all a game, to test Patrick's patience and to judge the depth of his desperation. Finally, after what seemed to be a painful eternity, Mr. Potts simply grimaced and stated flatly, "No," without any explanation. Patrick grabbed Potts by the sleeve and begged, "Please, sir, reconsider. I'll give you a dandy of a deal." "No, boy," Mr. Potts smiled coldly. "Now release me and get out." Patrick's jaw went slack with shock. He released the old man's arm and felt as if the hope of saving his father from debtor's prison was slipping through his fingers. Brushing off his sleeve, as if Patrick's touch soiled him, Potts reiterated, "Go on now. Out with you." Patrick staggered through the shop's front room towards the door. When he looked over his shoulder to take a glimpse of Potts one more time, maybe his father's competition would change his mind. That this was all a ploy to lower the cost of what he'd have to pay for Patrick's valuable snippets. Potts had strutted to behind his shop counter where another man in a rich red coat was casually leaning. Both men grinned maliciously and spoke to each other in cutting, hushed tones. Embarrassingly, Patrick was startled by the sound of the tiny bell hung above the shop's door, which chimed softly as he made his exit. The 2 men roared with laughter, and Patrick could only hang his head and walk out with a defeated gait. Humiliated, Patrick slowly began his dejected ambulation home, his mind scrambling to find words that he could tell his poor mother that his last desperate plan was a failure. He thought about his poor little sisters and how they would fare in a life of poverty with no dowry and no prospects for betterment, when suddenly he felt a red-hot burning sensation flash across his jaw. It felt like he had stuck his face in a fire. Grasping his jaw, he fell to his knees, withering in pain. To his astonishment, he realized the puddle of blood forming on the ground around his knees was from the blood dripping off his own chin. He then felt a hard boot slam against his back, forcing him prone into the mud. The thief knew right where Patrick's pouch of his valuables was hidden and deftly ripped it from his clothes. Looking over his shoulder, Patrick could only see the backside of the thief running quickly down the street. For a brief moment, Patrick was sure he caught a glimpse of a red rich coat as the thief darted around the corner. It took the assaulted young man a few sands of time to figure out what just happened. His head spun and his face throbbed with pain. He called out for help, but strangers just ignored him. The man appeared as a seemingly low pauper, bleeding in the street, and witnesses continued to walk by without even making eye contact. The strangers knew it was entirely too dangerous to get involved in other people's business. The locals knew that exposing a thief was the fastest way to put your own family in danger and find a dagger in your back. With no one to help, Patrick collected himself and tried to stop the crimson gushing from his left cheek by pressing his sleeve against the gaping wound. He knew chasing the thief was futile, and he had better get home as fast as possible to control blood flow and clean the wound. Nothing kills a man as slow and painful as sepsis. When he finally made it home, Patrick's entire family sat around the kitchen table and cried as he told them what happened. How Potts offered him nothing, laughed him out of his shop, and how Patrick fell victim to the road agent. When he was done telling his sorry story, the whole family was silent. His small, straw-haired sister Garland came over and held his hand. Patrick's family knew what this failure meant, and that the consequences were ghastly. The Willis family owed the sanitarium a great deal of money. Since his father was a prominent jeweler, the sanitarium assumed Mr. Willis had plenty of money and extended him credit. After a few months, the sanitarium wised up and threw Patrick's father into the streets demanding payment. Immediately, the sanitarium lodged a complaint with the officials, and it was expected that soon the elder sick patriarch would be dragged off to debtor's prison. 2 days after Patrick failed to sell the jewelry scraps to Potts and was robbed by the road agent, his father died at the humble home they were renting. With tears in her eyes, Patrick's mother sold the wedding ring her husband handcrafted for her to pay for his funeral services and for the following month's rent. It was a simple and solemn funeral, poorly attended from fear of catching the consumption from the corpse of old man Willis. The service was heart-wrenching. The sobbing of Patrick's mothers and sisters, who were grieving openly and loudly, was muffled by the sounds of the heavy falling rain. Garland wept loudly and hugged Patrick's leg as their father was entombed into the earth. Then, as Patrick made his way from the grave, 2 agents of His Majesty, King George II, grabbed each of Patrick's arms. He knew he was out of time. By King's law, it was decreed that the oldest son become responsible for the father's debt. This statute was not usually enforced on one as young as Patrick, but unfortunately, his family's debt was sizable. He said his goodbyes to his family, and he calmly walked away with the agents escorting him. The sobbing sounds that came from his huddled family broke Patrick's heart. Although his mother and sisters vowed to work hard and pay off the debts to free Patrick, they all knew it would be impossible to come on to such a large sum. Patrick's first prison cell was nowhere near as bad as the one he was currently residing in. The people demanded of their king that mercy be shown on debtors and the poor. More and more, the king and his parliament were expected to pay for people's incarcerations. Initially, debtors would be charged room and board at a private facility in addition to the debt they owed. Families on the outside were expected to work harder or sell off their belongings to pay off the debt of their imprisoned loved ones as fast as they could, so as not to incur an insurmountable sum. The longer a prisoner was incarcerated, the larger and larger the debt grew, due to daily fees. Once a prisoner's debt got too unmanageable, the private facility quickly realized they would not make a profit and moved the debtor to the king's debtors' prison. The government prisons were worse than hell, and Patrick resided in the most infamous of them all. When he was young, Patrick's father read to him illegal papers of the Enlightenment doctrines. These ideas were radical and talked of such things as a man being born with rights, and that these rights were not bestowed on him from king or church. His father told him, "As history has always shown, any government program will run far worse than the private market would." The king's prisons were no exception to this. The crown begrudgingly spent as little as it could on these hellholes. In past times, the king simply executed the troublesome poor prisoners who were nuisances to him. But now he had not been so openly tyrannical. George II wanted to give the appearance that he was a compassionate king, so he created social programs. He hoped to avoid the negative gossip in the socialite circles stirred by executing so many poor, nonviolent subjects. He did not want to be publicly exposed as the tyrant he truly was. The king determined it was far easier to keep his subjects within his law if they felt their concerns were being heard by a sympathetic ruler. Recently, King George was pressured by powerful socialites to show compassion and extend his benevolence to the debtors' prison. Many subjects had at least one relative in these dungeons, and this was a popular societal concern. But soon the king discovered he was quickly going broke being compassionate. Patrick was imprisoned in September 1728. When he was still in a private system of prisons, he met a good fellow named Robert Castle, who was a publisher. Castle had published a book on architecture, and he was imprisoned for the debts he incurred by publishing it. Robert told Patrick that there was so much excitement about the book, private investors practically threw money at him through loans. The book was called The Villas of the Ancients, and it focused on ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Greek and Roman architecture was all the rage in upper London society. Sadly, it was poorly timed. Robert took too long to release it, and by the time it was published, the frenzy of Greek and Roman architecture had fallen out of fashion. The book was a total failure, and Castle incurred a tremendous amount of debt. Robert was a really nice fellow. Patrick and him became quick friends. Patrick assumed that he must remind Robert of a little brother or maybe a nephew, but never confirmed this notion. The young prisoner did not care what the reason was. A friend was welcome in this lonely place. They rotated watch so they could sleep safely and unmolested. Robert even taught Patrick how to play chess in the dirt with some rocks he collected. He used to tell Patrick that this was the game of kings and royalty. It did help pass the time, which dragged on. Patrick's family never paid 1 shilling towards his debt. He imagined his mother and sisters needed everything they could get just to pay for rent and put food on the table. After they earned each other's trust, Robert shared a secret with Patrick. The day he was incarcerated, he dispatched a message to his friend, James Edward Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe was a high-ranking military official and an old friend of Robert's. Robert promised his old friend could help, but sadly, before Oglethorpe could do anything for the men, Patrick and Robert were moved from the clean private prison to the den of stench, which was the king's debtors' prison. Upon entering their new cell, the offensive, dank stench announced the squalid conditions immediately. Robert pleaded with the guard to move them back to their private jails. Angered by this request, the vindictive, cruel guard had Patrick and Robert moved to the filthiest, most infested cell in the entire prison. The sadistic sentry seemed to enjoy prodding Robert and mockingly asked, "Will the privacy of this cell suit your delicate disposition, sir?" After the heavy cell door clanged shut and the lock clicked, Patrick could hear the laughter of the guards echoing down the hall as they walked away. The same watchmen seemed to delight in torturing Robert. He would purposely add inmates to their dark cell whose minds were violent or touched with insanity. Among raving lunatics and violent men who were more like animals, Robert and Patrick had to fight just to keep a piece of moldy bread or a ladle of water. The worst of the insane cellmates would smear themselves with their own feces and at night would toss urine or sperm on other cellmates while they slept. Many of these demented souls were murdered in their sleep, especially the ones who had lesions of the brain, who were touched and made mad. They so disgusted and annoyed the other prisoners, they were commonly strangled to hell their first night in the cell. Robert was surviving as well as expected until the corrupt, cruel guard decided to make the cell the infirmary for the smallpox victims. Robert soon fell sick from smallpox and died a terrible death shortly thereafter. The prison rumor mill told Patrick that Oglethorpe finally arrived. He was furious about his friend's death. It took Patrick a while to piece all these fragments of information together, but this is what he gleaned. Oglethorpe had enough political favor to initiate investigation of the jails after the death of his dear acquaintance, Robert. He even boldly took a committee to investigate the king's prison. The findings were eventually reported to the Parliament and king, who were either truly shocked about the deplorable conditions or faked their disgust well. When the news broke about the investigation, the subjects and powerful socialites demanded something be done immediately. Oglethorpe's report was used as a pawn in the political chess game, and it caused a resounding rally cry for reform. In fact, the crooked jailer that made Patrick and Robert's life hell was publicly called out and taken to trial. It was such big news, it made it into the monthly periodical and was not even censored away from the public. Of course, nothing really changed in Patrick's jail. The officials merely cleaned up a few cells and a handful of prisoners, then invited the authorities to inspect their reformed prison. Once the official inspections were over, the prison returned to being one giant pestilence and pox factory. Over the years of his imprisonment, Patrick heard more of this Oglethorpe character attempting to reform the prisons. He assumed Oglethorpe was so upset about Robert's death that it ignited a burning in his soul for a sense of justice. The military officer lobbied the Parliament to consider a bill for relief for insolvent debtors. He also was selected as director of the Royal West Africa Company. Patrick later heard that directing this company put a bitter taste on his tongue for the practice of slavery. The prisoner even heard a strange rumor that Oglethorpe was trying to teach Indian heathens to accept Anglican beliefs. The thought of seeing all those savages wearing their feather headdresses in church would make Patrick laugh heartily. Eventually, Oglethorpe and his friend Lord Percival came up with the notion to take all the debtors and other criminals filling the prisons in England and move them to the colonies in America. They made an appointment with King George II to bring this idea in front of him. Patrick was later told that Oglethorpe tried to win favor with logic. He sold the idea that it would solve a few of the king's problems in one move. He argued that the royal colony of Charlestown in South Carolina was being harassed and harangued by the Spanish and savages from Florida, and that a new colony could act as a buffer against such attacks. He went on to explain the advantages of having subtropical crops for the crown to exploit. Many merchants were getting very rich trading commodities from the colonies because England's soil was too sandy to grow most crops. Nevertheless, what sold the king on the idea was relief to his burdened treasury. Oglethorpe suggested that the king provide relief to the debtors and poor by removing them from England and freeing them to work in the colonies. He knew if all reason failed, he could appeal to His Majesty's coffers. The king was rumored to have ruminated over this for a while, but Oglethorpe closed the deal with one capital idea. He offered the king, if he would let him establish the new colony, Oglethorpe would name the territory after him and christen it Georgia. Appealing to his purse and now his ego, the king loved the notion and instantly took all credit for the idea, like all politicians do. So on June 8th, 1732, the king signed a charter for the colony of Georgia. This planned for a clutch of politicians and board trustees, which would manage the colony for 21 years until it was recognized as an official colony. Although the king and parliament directly appointed these boards of trustees, they would become difficult to control due to the vast expanse of the ocean between the colonies and the mother country. Corruption became widespread on these boards, making many trustees members very wealthy through nefarious side deals. As with all governments through time, it was a game of rewarding one's friends and punishing one's enemies using the legitimacy of state powers. The first ship, called the Anne, with a little over 100 settlers, had landed in a place in Georgia called Savannah. They dropped anchor on February 12, 1733, and the settlers began working immediately. They were trying to build a healthy infrastructure in the settlement before they opened the floodgates to all the prisoners about to be shipped over. Moreover, those first in and positioned properly, stood to make the most profit. As far as the promise of moving debtors to America, it took a long while. Many fell ill and died of disease waiting for their turn. Shuffled from one crap-filled cell to another shit and maggot-infested dungeon for years now, Patrick could not believe that he had defied death so long in that stew of filth. He had miraculously survived 5 whole years since the new colony, Georgia, had been established, still clinging to hope and waiting for his turn. Just to entertain themselves, each day the guards would lie to Patrick and say he was next to leave. The watchmen continually promised everyone that they were on the next ship leaving. Patrick could almost stop believing that there was even a real place called Savannah, and there was any hope of escape. One thing that kept him going was his 2 friends he had made in his 5-year nightmarish ordeal. Isaac Schwartz came to the cell 2 years ago because of his massive gambling debts. Built like a bull, he was a Jew who once was employed as a debt collector. Schwartz was in his late 20s and had scars all over his body from a lifetime of knife fighting and beatings. He was certain he would wake up dead if he did not make friends fast because he was so reviled. Over the years as a debt collector, Schwartz had broken and beat many of the men he was now imprisoned with as a debtor himself. Patrick was too frightened of the hulking Isaac to point out the irony of it all. Since Isaac was so massive and strong, he always seemed to get the horrid duty of dragging the corpses from the cell. The Jewish man was getting weaker from each body he moved to the fire pit because he was getting so emaciated and thin. Patrick's other friend was a wiry Irish fellow named Seamus Rudd. He had flame crimson hair, ghost white skin, freckles, and very few teeth. He arrived about a half a year ago after he took a large loan out to start a bar. Later he told Patrick more of the truth. Red was from a wealthy family and used their good name to obtain credit. His father was so infuriated he paid off the debt of the bar and then transferred the debt to his son. By King's law, Seamus was now legally indebted to his father and could be held accountable for it. His father disowned his prodigal son and reported him to the collection agent. Soon after, Seamus ended up in the cell with Patrick, hopelessly waiting for his father to regret the decision and buy back his freedom. Seamus made one fatal mistake when he opened his business. He forgot to calculate the cost of his love for the devil's piss. The doors of his bar were only open a short time before Seamus ran out of beer and liquor. Spirits. Some people are angry drunks. Some people are happy drunks. Seamus was a generous drunk and a fool. When he became inebriated, he gave away too much of his stores. He had many friends, but little profits. The bar seemed to flourish with crowds every night, But that was because the patrons knew that if they got Seamus drunk, the drinks would flow freely all night. Like vultures, they would circle Seamus, waiting for his speech to slur and his grin to grow wide, the telltale sign that the spirits were about to become free. Patrick and Isaac theorized Seamus must only be surviving on pure spirit. Even in this dung palace, he still smiled and joked like a man with no worries.